They said, "We're too busy for your problems, Mom. Figure it out yourself." And you know what? I did. I figured out everything quietly, carefully, without telling a single one of them. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 67 years old. I live alone in a 3-bedroom house in rural Tennessee, and for the past 4 years, I have been trying to understand how I raise 3 children who look right through me like I am made of glass. I want to be honest with you from the very beginning, because I think that's the only way this story is worth telling. I was not a perfect mother. I made mistakes, real ones, the kind that leave marks. I need you to know that before I tell you what my children did, and before I tell you what I had already done about it. Let me start at the beginning. My husband, Gerald, passed away 6 years ago this past March. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the last breath, that's all we had. 11 weeks to say everything we'd meant to say for 38 years of marriage, to hold hands in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria food, to watch the man I loved more than anything on this earth slowly become someone I barely recognized. Gerald was a contractor, built custom homes for 40 years in Middle Tennessee. He was good at it. And we were comfortable, not rich, but comfortable. When he died, he left me the house, a modest savings account, and a piece of property he'd been holding onto for over 20 years. 43 acres outside of Gatlinburg, up in the Smoky Mountains. Beautiful land. A small cabin on it that he'd built himself with leftover lumber from various jobs over the years. He called it our someday place. Someday we'll retire up there. Someday we'll sit on that porch and do nothing. Someday. Someday never came for Gerald, but the land was mine now, and it was worth considerably more than when he'd bought it. The Smoky Mountains had exploded with tourism. Cabin rentals up there were pulling in serious money. Gerald's 43 acres, with its hand-built cabin and its mountain views, had been appraised at just over $800,000. My 3 children knew that number. They knew it because I told them, foolishly, in a moment of grief and openness, sitting around my kitchen table about a month after the funeral. My oldest is my son Richard. He's 41. Lives in Nashville. Works in finance. Richard has always been the practical one, the one who sees everything as a transaction. I love him. I have always loved him. But I have not always liked the man he became. And I think, if I am being honest, I have to take some responsibility for that. My middle child is my daughter, Patrice. She's 38. Patrice went through a difficult divorce 4 years ago and came out the other side with a lot of debt and a lot of anger, some of it directed at me, for reasons I still don't fully understand. We used to be close. Now we exchange birthday texts and not much else. My youngest is my daughter, Becca. She's 35. Becca lives about 40 minutes from me, which sounds like it would mean we see each other often. We do not. Becca has 2 kids of her own, a busy life, and a way of making me feel like every phone call is an interruption. After Gerald died, I was lost. I don't think I understood how much of my daily life had been organized around another person until that person was suddenly gone. I rattled around this big house. I couldn't sleep. I stopped cooking real meals. I watched television I don't even remember watching. And here is where I have to be honest about my mistakes. When I felt that loneliness getting too heavy, I reached for the only tool I knew would get a response: money. I called Richard and mentioned that I was thinking about having the mountain property surveyed. Maybe adding his name to it. He called me back within the hour. I told Patrice I wanted to help her pay off some of her divorce debt, and suddenly she had time for Sunday phone calls. I offered to help Becca with her kids' college funds, and she started stopping by on Saturday afternoons. I told myself I was just being generous. I told myself this was what mothers do, they help their children. But somewhere underneath that, I knew. I was buying their attention. I was substituting money for connection because I didn't know how to ask for connection outright. And my children, to their credit and their shame, let me do it. They accepted every check, every offer, every gesture, and gave me back just enough warmth to keep me hopeful. This went on for about 2 years. Then I got sick. Nothing fatal, I want to be clear. But I developed a heart condition that required surgery, a valve replacement, and the recovery was longer and harder than I had expected. I was in the hospital for 9 days, and then I came home to this big house, and I could not drive, could not cook properly, could barely manage the stairs for the first 2 weeks. I called Richard from the hospital the night before my surgery. I told him what was happening. There was a pause, and then he said, "Mom, I've got a huge deal closing next week. Is there someone else who can help?" I said I suppose there was. He said, "I'll try to get down there when things settle." Things never settled, apparently, because he didn't come. I called Patrice. She said she was sorry. That sounded really hard, and that she was dealing with some things of her own right now. She asked me to keep her posted. I called Becca the morning of my surgery from the hospital room before they took me back. She answered on the third ring. I said, "Becca, I'm about to go in for heart surgery." She said, "Oh, Mom, I know. I've just been so slammed. I told the kids to draw you a card." I said, "That's very sweet." She said she'd try to visit that weekend. She did not visit that weekend. The person who was there was my niece, Claire. Claire is my younger brother's daughter. She's 32, lives about 2 hours away, teaches elementary school. She took 3 personal days and drove down and sat in that waiting room by herself for 6 hours while they replaced my heart valve. She was the first face I saw when I came out of recovery. She stayed 4 days, slept in my guest room, made soup, helped me shower, watched bad television with me, and didn't ask for a single thing. When she left, I cried for an hour. Not from sadness, exactly. More like the feeling of recognizing something true about your life that you had been avoiding seeing. I recovered, slowly, then steadily. 3 months later, I was mostly myself again. And in those 3 months of being quiet and still and unable to distract myself, I did a great deal of thinking. I thought about Gerald, who had always said that money was something you used to build a life, not to hold people hostage. I thought about what I had actually built with my money over the past 2 years. I thought about Richard's pause on the phone, Patrice's careful vagueness, Becca's card that her children drew. And I thought about Claire, who had missed 3 days of work, driven 4 hours round trip, and sat alone in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours. For me, because she wanted to, because that is what love looks like when it doesn't want anything back. I made an appointment with my attorney. Howard has been my attorney for 20 years, handled Gerald's estate, handles my affairs. I sat across from him in his office and I told him everything: the mountain property, the appraised value, my children, Claire, my heart surgery, the recovery, all of it. Howard listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always respected about him. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He said, "Are you sure?" I said I had never been more sure of anything since choosing to marry Gerald. We spent 2 sessions rewriting everything. My will, my medical directives, my power of attorney, the mountain property, Gerald's 43 acres, the cabin he built with his own hands, the land we always called our someday place, was placed into a trust with Claire as the sole beneficiary. The rest of my estate was divided, modestly, among my 3 children. They would not be left with nothing. But the thing they had been eyeing, the valuable thing, the thing worth nearly $1 million in a hot market that was going somewhere else. I want to tell you that I felt guilty about this. I want to be sympathetic to myself and say I lost sleep over it. I didn't. What I felt was something closer to clarity, like the fog I'd been living in for years had finally lifted and I could see the shape of my own life plainly. I did not tell my children what I had done. I saw no reason to. I continued on as normal, the occasional phone call, the birthday texts, the Christmas cards. I did not offer any more financial arrangements. I did not dangle anything. I simply stopped performing and waited to see what would happen when the performance ended. What happened was almost nothing. The phone calls became less frequent. Becca stopped the Saturday visits. Patrice's Sunday calls faded away. Richard sent a few emails about nothing in particular that felt like someone maintaining a contact list rather than reaching out to a mother. That was fine. That was the truth of things, laid plain. Then, about 8 months after my surgery, something shifted. Richard called me, not texted. Called on a Tuesday afternoon. He asked how I was feeling. He asked about my heart. He asked, somewhat carefully, whether I had given any more thought to the mountain property. because he had been talking to someone who worked in property development, and apparently the area was really heating up. I said I was feeling well, thank you. He asked if I'd considered listing it. I said I hadn't. He said, and I remember the exact phrasing, "Mom, it just seems like you're sitting on something that could really benefit the whole family." I said I would think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. That call seemed to open a door, because Patrice called that Friday. Same general conversation, different angle. She mentioned that her financial situation was still pretty rough, and that she'd been thinking about the property and whether there was some arrangement we could make. She said it almost gently, like she was doing me a favor by raising it. Then Becca texted me the following week asking if she and her husband could come for dinner Saturday. I said of course. They came, they ate my food, and after dinner, while her husband was in the living room watching television, Becca sat across from me at this very kitchen table and said, "Mom, we really need to talk about that property in Gatlinburg." I looked at my daughter across the table, and I thought about Claire alone in a waiting room for 6 hours. I said, "What about it?" She said they'd been thinking. All three of them, she said all three of us, like it was coordinated, which it clearly was, that it might make sense for the family to use it. Manage it together, run it as a rental property maybe. Share the income. She said it quickly, like she'd rehearsed it. And then at the very end she said, "We were thinking it might be time to go up there and take stock of the situation. Walk the property. Look at the cabin. We'd need the key. Obviously. She wanted the key to Gerald's cabin. I kept my face very still. I said, "Let me make some coffee." I got up, went to the kitchen, stood at the counter while the coffee brewed, and I breathed. I thought about Gerald building that cabin board by board. I thought about him calling it our someday place. I thought about 11 weeks. I thought about a waiting room. Then I brought 2 cups of coffee back to the table and I sat down and I said, "Becca, I hear you. Let me talk to Howard first, and then we'll have a family conversation." She nodded, looking satisfied. She thought Howard was just going to bless the plan. 3 weeks later, Richard drove down from Nashville. Patrice flew in from Phoenix. Becca came with her husband. They all sat in my living room on a Saturday morning in October with the leaves turning orange on the trees outside. And they looked like a family gathering, which I suppose it was. I had called Howard the week before and asked him to be available by phone. I had also done one other thing I will tell you about in a moment. I let them talk first. Richard went through a whole presentation, practically. He talked about property management, rental income projections, market values in the Smoky Mountains, the cost of upgrading the cabin. Patrice talked about how keeping it in the family made more sense than selling. Becca talked about how much the grandchildren would love it, how they could have family vacations there, how it could bring everyone closer. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. When they finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Richard leaned forward slightly and said, "So what do you think, Mom? We just need you to give us access to walk the property and start putting some plans together. The key, do you have it handy?" I looked at my 3 children. I thought about 11 weeks. I thought about a waiting room. I said, "I need to share something with you." I picked up my phone and I called Howard on speaker. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Howard, I'm here with the kids. Can you walk them through the current status of the mountain property?" There was the briefest of pauses, and then Howard, in the careful and precise voice he uses when delivering information people don't want to hear, explained that the 43 acres and the cabin in Gatlinburg had been placed in a revocable trust approximately 8 months prior. He explained the nature of the trust. He explained who the beneficiary was. The room went very quiet. Richard said, "I'm sorry. Who is the beneficiary?" Howard said, "Claire, your mother's niece." Patrice made a sound I don't have a word for. Becca looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "I want to be very clear that this was not a decision I made in anger. I thought about it for a long time. And I thought about who showed up when I was lying in a hospital bed waiting for heart surgery. I thought about who sat in that waiting room for 6 hours. I thought about who slept in my guest room and made my soup and helped me when I could not help myself. I paused, and I thought about who did not. Richard said, "Mom, we didn't know it was that serious." I said, "I called you the night before my surgery." He didn't say anything to that. Patrice said it wasn't fair, that they had their own lives, that they had responsibilities. I said, "I know, and I have mine. I'm responsible for what I do with what Gerald and I built together. I believe I have handled that responsibility the way Gerald would have wanted." Becca was crying quietly. "I don't say that to be cruel, I say it because it happened." She said, "So that's it? We just lose it?" I said, "I'm not punishing you. Your father and I worked hard, and the three of you will receive what we set aside for you in the original will. I changed one thing, and I changed it because someone earned it, not through transactions, not through arrangements, just by showing up." We sat in that living room for another hour. There were more tears, more arguments, more attempts to relitigate decisions that had already been made in Howard's office months ago. Richard asked if the trust could be contested. Howard, still on the phone, explained the conditions under which that would be very difficult and very costly to attempt. That ended that line of conversation. Eventually, one by one, they left. Richard was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway and turned around and looked at me, and for just a moment, he looked less like a 41-year-old man in finance and more like the little boy who used to fall asleep in Gerald's lap watching football. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't come, Mom." Just that. I said, "I know." He left. I stood at the window and watched their cars pull out of the driveway. And then I stood there a little longer and looked at the Tennessee hills and thought about Gerald. I want to tell you what happened next, because I don't think this story is only about property and wills and who got what. I think it's about something that took me too long to learn. About a month after that October Saturday, Richard called me. Not about the property, he just called. He asked how my heart was doing, whether I was keeping my follow-up appointments. He came down for Thanksgiving, just showed up, without being asked, without any arrangement attached to it. He sat at my table and he ate my food, and he helped with the dishes, and we talked about Gerald, which we hadn't done in years. Patrice and I are still finding our way. She called in December, and the conversation was awkward and careful, but it was real. She told me she'd been seeing a therapist, had been talking about our relationship, about money, about her divorce. I told her I was glad. I meant it. Becca is harder. She is still hurt, and I understand that, but she has started bringing her kids over on Saturdays again, and I am not going to push. I am just going to be here, and be steady, and see what grows. And Claire doesn't know yet. I haven't told her about the trust. Howard says I should do it in person, and I'm going to drive up and see her this spring, when the dogwoods bloom. I'll sit across from her, and I'll tell her what she means to me. I'll tell her what her Uncle Gerald would have thought of her. I'll tell her about someday. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. If you take away anything, I spent years giving my children money because I didn't know how to give them honesty. I kept my loneliness to myself and substituted checks for conversations. And I let them drift into a version of our relationship that was built on transactions rather than truth. That was my fault, not theirs. They learned from what I modeled. I am 67 years old. I do not know how many years I have left, or what condition they'll be in. What I know is that I do not want to spend them managing people's feelings about what they might inherit. I want to spend them being real. I want the people around me to be there because they want to be there, not because they are waiting for something. Gerald always said that a house is just lumber and nails until someone fills it with the right things. He was talking about construction, but he was also, I think, talking about everything else. I'm trying to fill mine with the right things now, slowly, honestly, and a little late. But not too late. That's what I keep telling myself. Not too late.